Let's go ahead and get started. So hi, I'm Jeannine Cavender-Bares at the University of Minnesota, and I'm really delighted to introduce our keynote speaker for this year's virtual symposium of the Biodiversity RCN. And that's Dr. Benis Egoh, who is faculty in the Department of Earth System Science at the University of California-Irvine. And prior to being at UCI, she received her PhD in zoology from Stellenbosch University in South Africa and spent 20 years in South Africa. She's originally from Cameroon, where she did her undergraduate work. She also did a master's degree in Nigeria. Before she came to the US, she was working for the Joint Research Center, European Commission in Italy, and the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. And I first met Benis at a sustainability meeting in Japan, and then through the IPBES process, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, where Benis was a coordinating lead author for the African regional assessment of IPBES, and she also served in various capacities on that report. And I think it's fair to say that report would not have happened if Benis hadn't been involved in it. It was a huge amount of work for the African group, and relatively few hands compared to some of the other assessments. And she's widely cited, highly published and widely cited, a number of very highly cited publications on mapping ecosystem services. She's a member of several GeoBond working groups. She's an editor for several different journals, associate editor for several different journals, and is a highly sought after conservation biologist and consultant on ecosystem services. And so it's really an honor and a delight to get to introduce Benis Egoh to talk to us today about degrading nature. Can biodiversity conservation tools rescue ecosystem services? With that, on to you, Benis.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much. I was muted. Jeannine, it's a pleasure to give a talk, and thanks so much for the invite. I feel honored to join your group. I've titled the talk today, Degrading Nature, Can Biodiversity Tools Rescue Ecosystem Services? This is just my way of saying that to what extent can we use biodiversity tools to respond to the degradation of ecosystem services themselves. And I always like to have an outline, but don't crucify me if I don't follow it. But I put here that I'll talk a little bit about the degradation that is taking place around the world and in some of the work that I've done. And then I will look at the links between biodiversity and humans, and then look at some biodiversity tools, to what extent they preserve ecosystem services. Look at restoration. A lot of my work is now and in the past years have been on restoration as a tool for safeguarding ecosystem services, and what I think that gives you some ideas of what I think is the way forward. So I put a slide. I picked most of this from the global assessments. The global IPBES, I don't know if most of you know the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. I've had several assessments in recent years, one of which was the African assessments. I'm not going to be quoting the African assessments today because I'm going to show mostly some of the work that I've done. But the global assessments found that most of land, about 75% of land area is significantly altered. So we can see that there's a lot of transformation that is ongoing, and about 85%, in fact, more than 85% of wetlands have been lost. Okay, about 32 million hectares of primary forest has been lost between 2010 and 2015. So this is really significant if you come to think of it, that we're losing nature irrespective of all the efforts that we have put, our colleagues and all the people working in the conservation sector have put into saving nature. And one of the key findings from this assessment is that 14 out of the 18 categories of ecosystem services, or what you call nature's contribution to people, have been lost. They are declining. The trend is downward. It's not going upward. But primarily because of agricultural production, fish harvest, our energy production, and the taking of materials from nature. Okay, so this work, I did it in South Africa. One of my students looked at the changes in land cover between 1970 and 2010. And as you can see, it's just been going, about 40% of the land cover is lost already, of natural areas have been lost. In this small area in South Africa, it's called the Umgeni catchment area, very important area for water in KwaZulu-Natal. 40% of land lost. And what are the culprits? Cultivation, forest plantation, urban built up areas, and of course, rural areas, the both count as urban areas or human built areas. So nature is being degraded and being transformed. This is a fact. This is not something that we can argue about. And we looked at, in the same study, we looked at 5 different ecosystem services, all of them downward trends in carbon. We're going downward, soil retention, water quality regulation, grazing, food production, all of them downward trend. And when I talk about food, we looked at wild foods as well as another study that Belinda Reyes, one of my colleagues and supervisor, PhD supervisor, looked at in another small area. This is called the Karoo area in South Africa, showed that many of their ecosystem services, again, 5 ecosystem services, have been degraded and reduce erosion control by about 40%, carbon about 30%, tourism, water flow regulation, forage. So ecosystem services are being degraded beyond the minimum assessment that already found that 60% of ecosystem services around the world are being degraded or transformed. We still say this is still ongoing. And I put this slide because most of the time ecosystem services, the work in ecosystem services has been seen with the eyes of biodiversity. So it's always been about making a case for nature. And may the soul of Jeannine Mays rest in peace. This part of the slide, the left-hand part of the slide is what she termed the history of conservation, how it has, we have progressed as a society in the past years, where we have come from in the 60s, just talking about nature for itself, to the 90s, where we started talking about nature for people. And I think in the 90s, the landmark publications from Gretchen Daly and Constanza would put a value on nature, and Gretchen Daly's book just described the benefits that human gets from nature, were really the key point, the key turning point for bringing the work on ecosystem services into limelight, to understand how nature contributes to human well-being. That led to the Millennium Assessment, but also now we have, in 2012, we have a vibrant community of people working on ecosystem services, the ESP, in which I'm an executive committee member. We have about 3,000 people interacting and working in that space. So we have come a long way, and really moved from looking at how much is nature worth, what are the benefits of nature, who benefits from nature, and the relationship between nature and people, to the IBES assessment, even though it's primarily looking at how humans benefit from nature and how it's nature's contribution to people is degrading. I think that with the values assessments and some other assessments, we have really shift the bar from just thinking about ecosystem services in terms of nature to actually thinking about people and interactions between nature and people. So what's the link between biodiversity and ecosystem services? I put this slide. In some of my work, I've looked at ecosystem services hotspots and how that relates to biodiversity. And what I found was that for some ecosystem services, particularly water flow regulation, we had higher numbers of dead species in the hotspots of the ecosystem service than random. Although we didn't find many relationships with surface water retention in this case, I did not put the correlations. The correlations actually show that there was a modest relationship between almost all the ecosystem services and biodiversity. I didn't put the correlations here. I should have put the correlations so you can see. This was just looking at the hotspots and see how the species richness of different biodiversity features are represented in the hotspots of ecosystem services. And then we also had this work that we did in Europe, just looking at the relationships, how many papers have cited the relationships between, or have studied, not necessarily cited, studied the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we found that many studies supports the fact that biodiversity is related to is linked to ecosystem services. In fact, it underpins almost all ecosystem services. And here you can see that there were many on pollination, linking pollination with species richness. And of course, there were two other ones that linked water purification and water flow regulation with habitat or community area. As you can also see, many of the studies have shown a positive relationship rather than a negative relationship. Few negative relationships, but mostly positive relationships. And in this slide, I just show how many studies, more than 160 showing community area relationships. And so there were many studies that were leaning towards species richness, species abundance, community area, and some other traits like species size. So, but when we looked at, in South Africa, there's in a small area called the Skep, when we looked at the priority areas that have been selected for biodiversity, how they overlap with ecosystem services, we saw that there were very low overlap between biodiversity and those priority ecosystem services and those priority areas for biodiversity. This means that I was involved in this study actually, and when we were identifying the priorities in those days in terms of in this KEP project, we just looked at biodiversity features. So we would look at species abundance, species richness, endemic species, threatened species, and things like that, and vegetation types, and some ecological processes lately, like edaphic interfaces and gradients. So places that you have two biomes meeting, because it's shown that there's high species turnover in such places, and they're mainly biodiversity features and things related to biodiversity that we looked at. It's only recently we started looking at ecosystem services. So it's not surprising that there's so much low overlap between those priority areas and ecosystem services hotspots. And again, in the little area in Umgeni catchment, my students have looked at some of the biodiversity tools at the national level and how they relate to ecosystem services in that area. And we found that there were some that were really overlapping, like the National Protected Area Strategy. But remember, that's only a strategy. It's not necessarily the implementation of protected area in Umgeni. It's just the areas that have been highlighted and earmarked for the expansion to meet the 17% protection that was required for South Africa. And there was a high overlap there with the national protected areas. Not so much for the freshwater priority areas, and not so much for critical biodiversity areas, which are really a very strong biodiversity tool in South Africa. Overlap with special development framework, we've had that, but of course, if you know what it is, this is also a plan for municipalities to implement both their city plan and their conservation responsibilities, if I can say that. So it's not necessarily something that protects biodiversity or ecosystem services, but we included it in this study in any case. And over the years, we saw that even though protected areas have increased in that sort of area, you can also see how the loss of ecosystem services have increased. It means that protected areas are not necessarily safeguarding ecosystem services, even in that small area. And this slide is just to show, so the case is the same. The overlap in Europe is low. Overlap for protected areas and biodiversity in South Africa as a whole, it's also low. And many different vegetation types are also lacking in terms of protection. I just put this slide just to show the bigger picture in Europe, South Africa, and how it relates to the different vegetation types. So deserts mostly out of protected areas, succulent Karoo, grasslands, forest is highly protected, but that's only a small area in South Africa because most of the vegetation is savanna and grasslands and fynbos and succulents. So what can be done? As another study that we have carried out in the area in Karoo, we try to look at if you focus on conservation on biodiversity, and in this case, we only use vegetation types as the only biodiversity feature. To what extent do you capture ecosystem services? And if you were to include ecosystem services in the biodiversity target, do we really improve in terms of how much ecosystem services we capture? And so you might want to look at this picture. This is Steve Pulaski. I still remember the day we were in the veldt, that's what they call it in South Africa, looking at the fynbos vegetation there. This is the area where we did the study. We found that, sorry, I just went a bit forward. So we found that just looking at vegetation type in Karoo, you can capture 37% of carbon, 45% of fodder, and 57% of water. But if you were to include targets for ecosystem services, in this case, when I say target, we're not specifically targeting ecosystem services, but just making sure that the model picks biodiversity features that are in areas that ecosystem services are also high. So we set ecosystem services as a cost. So areas of high ecosystem services had a low cost so that the targets can be, the software can pick those first before they pick others. And we see that we can improve targets for biodiversity significantly if we consider ecosystem services in our conservation prioritization procedure. This is one of the key findings. Also in Europe, some of the work that I've done looking at areas, targeting areas for restoration in Europe, the question that I asked here was, which biodiversity features will we be focusing on if we want to improve the capturing of ecosystem services in Europe, in the restoration project in Europe? And we use species and habitat conservation. I don't think you understand this because this is a European thing. They have something that they call the habitat directives and the species directive, where they have a conservation status for all the different species and habitats in Europe. And we selected 4 different conservation status for both habitat and species. And we found that when you focus on habitats, you capture more ecosystem services than if you focus on individual species. This was just the key message for the slide. Okay, but I also wanted to just put this slide just to show that ecosystem services goals may not necessarily align with biodiversity goals, even if we desire that ecosystem services be included in conservation plans, and even if we desire that they should be included in protected area strategy, we must also face the reality that the highest amount of ecosystem services are not necessarily produced when nature is high, when naturalness is high, and put it that way. So some ecosystem services are produced by transformed areas and the more intense land use areas. So for certain ecosystem services like water regulation and carbon and air purification, you might want to have high natural areas but sometimes, and we have seen that in South Africa, that you find tourists going to transform areas, like the winelands in South Africa is very beautiful, but it's completely transformed with vineyards, and many tourists like to go there. So some ecosystem services may not necessarily align with biodiversity conservation goals. I showed this slide a few months ago. Yeah, many more and more conservation plans are including ecosystem services. That is good news. But we are still not seeing ecosystem services plans that are focused on ecosystem services, prioritizing areas for ecosystem services for conservation. We've not seen many of those, but in terms of including ecosystem services in biodiversity conservation prioritization procedures, we are seeing many more. And I wanted to just also talk about the inclusion of ecosystem services in restoration, because this is one of the key areas in which many ecosystem services are used to make a case for biodiversity in restoration projects. And we are seeing many restoration projects having the objective of sequestering carbon or providing water. In this case, in Africa, you have the Green Wall, which was designed to plant about 100 million hectares of degraded land with trees that will store carbon. And the sole aim for this project was carbon. Although I always say when I think of the Green Project is that there was no prioritization procedure, there was just an ad hoc project that they drew a line across Africa and then they said, we're gonna restore this area. And then we've also looked at some work that we did some work in South Africa, looking at areas where if we restore, we will, to prioritize areas where restoration will provide a lot of water supply for an area in, this is Umgen catchment as well, in KwaZulu-Natal. So we've seen many of those restoration projects. I just show some of them here. There are many in South Africa, but one that will be of interest to you is the one that we are doing now with a charity. This slide is thanks to my postdoc charity who sent it to me today. It's the work that we are doing in the Sierra Nevada forest. We're trying to look at what are the benefits from restoration, and just to make a case also for restoration, but also to raise some funds for the restoration action in the area, to look at who are the beneficiaries and how we can show the benefits of restoration in monetary terms, and also looking at some other indexes like health and job creation, hoping that we'll be able to convince some people to put money into restoring the forests. This project is ongoing, and we are looking now, I think we are busy mapping air purification services, linking it to fires in the region. Okay, I've already shown that slide. I'm going to show. So, despite all this initiative about restoration and ecosystem services, the IPBES assessment showed that many of the ecosystem services, the trends are going downward. As you can see, most of them are going downward. There isn't any single ecosystem services that is really going upward. So we need to develop a strategy for ecosystem services aside from biodiversity. Okay, this is not new. In South Africa, this park, the Drakensberg Maloti Park, was set aside for water purification, and it was protected by the Water Act. No, it wasn't necessarily the Protected Area Act that protected the land. It was the Water Act that protected the Drakensberg Maloti National Park. So we can still do that. We can still keep pushing for the setting aside of protected areas for ecosystem services. And there are some initiatives in terms of managing land conservancies in Namibia and Zimbabwe, which would be there are examples of such. But I think that we need to keep pushing the conversation to the direction where we can actually start seeing areas, natural areas being set aside for the sole purpose of conserving ecosystem services. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benis. Such an interesting talk with a really important topic for our RCN. Let's give everyone give Benis a virtual round of applause. And then Renato and I are going to field questions. You can place these in the chat or just raise a hand if you have a question. So we had a couple of just clarification questions that came up during your talk that are in the chat. So the first one was in the graph where you showed the increase in protected areas, but also the increasing decline in ecosystem services. Were those ecosystem service declines calculated within the protected areas, or was that in the region as a whole?
It was in the region as a whole.
Okay.
So it was in the region as a whole. This was just a comparison to show how the protected areas in the region have increased over time compared to the loss in ecosystem services, not necessarily the overlap. We're just showing the trends for the whole region.
Okay, thank you. And then Anna Carnival, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, Benis. Thank you for joining. I just had a clarification question when you were comparing habitats versus species and the benefits of their conservation. I was curious to understand how habitats were actually defined, just because this may relate to a question that was discussed in a breakout group right before you came that was interested in what's the value of processes happening above the species level. And maybe Rashid wants to join in this conversation too. So I just wanted to ask you, how were these habitats defined?
Is it the case of the one in Europe?
Yes, yes, the European Union study, yes. I'm sorry, yes.
Yes, so this is not something that anyone defined. It is something that is defined by the European Commission on the types of habitats that they think are important for conservation and that they would want to preserve. And they will also put a law that in this type of habitat, you're not allowed to do certain things, or you're not allowed to, you have to report. In fact, every country has to report about the status of the habitat in their national territory. I'm not sure how those are defined, but I would guess that it would be based on the threat status, the threatened status of the habitats, because the different countries submit the species of importance and the habitats, the important habitats to the Commission, and I think there is a committee that looks at those and select which ones have to go into the Habitat Directive because it's protected by law. So this is a process. I don't know completely how it's, but I know that for Natura 2000, for the protected area, which is also part of the strategy in Europe to protect habitat and species, people make a case. You submit an area and you say, I would like this area to be included in Natura 2000. And you would justify why you would want that area to be included. And some of the study that we did show that, I mean, different types of people would submit a report of a habitat they want to conserve. And some of them for moral reasons, interestingly, not necessarily for conservation reasons. So and we looked at the motivation for, not necessarily us, but our colleagues were looking for motivations for submissions those type of submissions, why people would want areas to be conserved, while we looked at what arguments that people were putting forward for those habitats. And most of them were related to ecosystem services, or the services that those habitats are providing.
Benis, while we wait for other people to raise their hands, I have a couple of questions actually, and one of them has to do with the trade-off you showed. It was provocative, the graph you showed, showing greater ecosystem services benefits as declining biodiversity, I think, or declining nature because of those services coming from transformed land. And I was just wondering, like, if you looked at those services in terms of regulating versus provisioning services, if you would, if you would then see a positive correlation, or if you actually put a value, like the not just the market value, but the total inclusive wealth value of all of those services, including climate regulation and water quality and so forth, if you would, because you basically have food versus natural area that shows up as a trade-off. But if you include clean water and healthy soil and climate regulation as the services that you're also getting from natural areas, I just wonder if that ends up being a positive correlation, if you sort of separate the provisioning and the regulating services.
So for the provisioning, let me talk about the provisioning. The reason I put them there is not necessarily because that is the desirable levels at which we want those provisioning services to be administered. Or this is not necessarily, we shouldn't be aiming to have like the maximum food as the most intensely used land. As you know, in Europe, they're trying to bring something that they call to reduce all kinds of intensification of land for food provision. So you can reduce those trade-offs. In South Africa, we have shown how if you were to, we put a value on grazing in South Africa, for example, because the carrying capacity that was defined in South Africa for grazing was actually degrading the land. So we looked at what will be the ideal carrying capacity for the land that will allow for the ecosystem services to persist and reduce degradation, and what will be that benefit or associated with a sustainable land management for grazing. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I'm just saying that those trade-offs can be reduced. So sometimes you can reduce the gap between the two by having sustainable practices. Of course, you know that once we have reached that extreme end of sustainability or unsustainable use, it's no longer a service. It becomes a stress or a pressure. We start defining them as drivers.
Okay, thank you. So there are a couple comments, questions. We'll go first to Vinicius and then to Rezit.
All right, it's just a short comment. Thank you for the talk, it was awesome. In Atlantic Forest here in Brazil, we have similar pressures over the forest. Even though we have less than 10% of the resting forest, people still want to decrease it more. And a lot of times they say that we need that to produce food. And we did, with Jeannine, we did a simple research, showing that decreasing the forest to produce food, it's way less efficient than you being better practice on producing food. It means if you produce in better way food, more productive over the lands you already have for food, you can keep the forest or even increase the area for forest. So I just punctuation that as a comment, because here at least a lot of time people make this as you need to choose about biodiversity or food, but that's not necessarily true. Sometimes they put that by their own, they want to make a trade-off that not necessary there, because you already have like 9% of the land or like 80% of the land through the food production, so you don't need that last 10%, you know. So like it's using sometimes the ecological tools that we use a lot for biodiversity, or the knowledge or the frameworks. When you apply that for showing that food production too, that's usually not our area, but using that tool, sometimes we can show them, see, like you could be producing better instead of trying to destroy the forest even more. It's just like a comment that popped up in my mind when I was seeing your presentation. So
that's absolutely correct. If you degrade the forest, you might have eutrophication in your rivers. That you might not have enough water for irrigation if you are it's a water scarce country like South Africa. I always give examples because that's where I've worked the most. But also you need the forest for pollination, for example. So the food production is not an isolated thing. It needs all of those other things. It needs the productivity and the landscape. If you have a better landscape, then you have better nutrients, and then you have better production. So this is what I'm aiming at. There's a project we are working on now on looking at trade, the impact of trade on biodiversity and ecosystem services. I didn't talk about it today because of the time constraints, but you will see that like palm oil, the cultivation of palm oil is just increasing. It's crazy increasing. All of us here on this call, I can assure you, are using palm oil in one way or the other. It's in everything. It's in cosmetics. It's in food. It's in ice cream. The last time I had was in ice cream. I couldn't believe it. And so we all using it. But what is the trade-off? So what are we giving up to be able to use palm oil? It looks like, when I look at the literature and I look at what we have been discussing with other colleagues, it looks like we can never get rid of it. We actually need it, but we have to do it in a sustainable way. And we are looking at how can we cultivate palm oil in sustainable ways. And we've had major big palm oil companies, they are committing to no deforestation and no degradation. And I think that's the way to go, is to look at those sustainabilities, not necessarily thinking that you have to cut the forest to achieve the food, but sometimes you might have to put some other measures in place, because food production does not necessarily mean it's not only one thing that you need. So I agree with you.
Jeannine, you muted.
Rezat, are you still there with your question? Okay.
Yes, I am. So thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting discussion of the correspondence of ecosystem services and biodiversity tools. Now, of course, one of the main tools for biodiversity is protected areas, but one can also argue how is the correspondence between protected areas and biodiversity, because traditionally a lot of protected areas are set up in areas that people don't want to use for other purposes, right? And now they are reaching biodiversity, some of them, because that's where biodiversity is left, but they were not necessarily the best places to set up. So is there any other way to analyze this by taking out this artificial confounding factor, because protected areas are not necessarily good for biodiversity either? So how can we look at this relationship without the kind of bias and artificial decisions people have made long time ago, some of it more recent, some of it farther away? How can we take out this aspect of this question away and look at the same relationship?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's interesting. In 2003, there was a study in South Africa that looked at the protected areas in South Africa, and they were all on the mountains. Okay, so I agree with you completely. And even today, we still have that bias, because people were putting protected areas in areas where they could not use the land for any other purpose. But we have come a long way now there are many tools that are being used to identify priority areas for ecosystems, for biodiversity in a systematic way. So systematic conservation planning has been around for about, I think 20 years now. And there are many protected areas that have been put in place, looking at maximizing species richness, looking at places where you have endemic species, looking at threats. So there are many things that we take into consideration. In fact, my background is in protected area planning. And so we look at a whole bunch of things, including land uses. We look at minerals, we look at who has applied for example, for a mining license and all of that in a very systematic way, and identify protected area where we should place a protected area. And I think that in many places now we have already accepted, and I agree with you that in some places there's no room to maneuver. Like Europe, it's been used, most of it has been built up, and there's no room to maneuver. But you have many other places around the world where they are using the systematic approach to identify areas for protection. At least in South Africa, there's a grassland park that we worked on about 10 years ago that we actually identified the area based on species richness, species abundance, threatened endemic species, and things. That's why I showed you in one of my figures, I showed you the vegetation types that the extent to which each vegetation type was in the protected area. That gap analysis was used to do a more detailed assessment for grassland so that we can have a grassland park.
Let's move to Miguel Trejo and then to Anna Schweiger.
Yeah, hello. So my question is regarding to, I would like to know if there is a link between your research and how you see the ecosystem services as nature-based solutions for the impacts, to face the impacts of climate change. So basically, because I'm working with disaster risk management, and I'm trying to actually include the nature-based solutions as a solution or mitigation measure to actually face the impacts of climate change. So I don't know if you actually have been working with that. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I saw your question in the chat. I was just going to get to it. Yes, I have a PhD student in South Africa before I moved here. She's still working on it. She's basically working on nature-based solutions to climate change adaptations strategies. I didn't show her work today, but there's some interesting work that we are doing in that space in South Africa. And I've just recruited my PhD student now is working on the impact of climate change on ecosystem services, but we're also going to look at some adaptation strategies for ecosystem services. I actually have a postdoc to also looking at solutions, looking at solar and wind energy and how that will impact on people's, how we can improve energy access while minimizing the impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So yes, there's some work. We have some work in that direction, which I didn't show here today.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anna. You're muted.
All right. Hi, Benis. Thanks for your great talk. My question is also about the topic, of protecting habitats versus species. So I'm wondering if, it makes sense to me to set areas aside to, provision specific ecosystem services. However, I'm wondering if a focus on ecosystem services might, lead to a controversy with the species protection, biodiversity protection folks. I'm thinking, maybe because the value of particular species might be even more difficult to assess than the value of ecosystem services. Yeah, I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that, and how, if there is controversy, or how it can be, prevented, and yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so one clarification about species against species versus habitats. Most of the time when we set targets for habitats, for example, the targets are based on species. So we will say, how much of a habitat do you need, for example, to preserve 75% of the species? So there's nothing like an individual habitat. It's made of species, and when we set targets for habitat, we definitely consider species. So ultimately, I think it's, I just wanted to make that clarification because it's about the species that makes up the habitat. And then my answer is that I think that we should use every tool, everything that we need to conserve nature, even if it's going through the lens of ecosystem services. But I'm also a really serious ecosystem service fan because I know that, there are many things that we are doing in our landscape that might jeopardize our well-being ourselves. And I've already, in some work that we have done, we have already shown that the arguments that are made for biodiversity with ecosystem services are more powerful than making any argument for biodiversity itself. So I don't really see a controversy. I just feel that we have to use the tools whenever and in a clever way, how we have to use them to preserve nature.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this really interesting discussion. Are there more questions from anyone in the audience? Do you have anything you want to add, Benis, to summarize your thoughts?
Renato, do you have a question? I thought you were putting your hand up. Sorry, I thought I put some.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, okay, all right. No, so I'm excited to be part of your group and for this work. The work on biodiversity and ecosystem services, I think there's a lot that we still need to do. Looking at different threats, there's still a big gap in looking at how different threats links to the work on ecosystem services and how the extinction of particular threats will impact on different ecosystem services. There's a lot that we still need to do in terms of how climate change is going to impact ecosystem services. We've done a lot in terms of biodiversity, but linking that biodiversity to climate change is something that we still have to do. But what I wanted to say in terms of the work that we are doing is that we always have to still really think about what tools we need for preserving ecosystem services, at least from my end, because I'm working with the ecosystem service community. Beyond what we have, we need to develop, I think we still need to develop more tools and push for more strategies for ecosystem services, especially now that the eBest assessment is out. The implementation of the eBest assessment is gonna need us to develop new strategies beyond protected areas. At least that's what I'm thinking. I didn't touch on payments for ecosystem services here today, but I don't think that is a strategy that is necessarily working at this point because there's many dimensions on payments of ecosystem services that that makes the payment itself a barrier, and the long-term payments for ecosystem services strategies are really still not well developed. But
Benis,
that's all.
So you're one of the few people that has worked on the ground on ecosystem services in very different contexts, from South Africa to European Union to California, really different governance contexts. And I just wondering if you see the tools for maintaining, sustaining ecosystem services as being the same in those different contexts, or being very different, being adjusted to the local governance system and stakeholders.
Definitely, it has to be adjusted to the local stakeholders. And thank you for that question. It's different depending on where you are or where you go. In South Africa, if we talk about ecosystem services and we talk about monetary value and we put whatever dollars on it, it doesn't really speak to to our policymakers. They want jobs. So if we put them in context of jobs, they will listen. If we put them in context of any other metrics. So the metrics are really, very important. Now in California, I see that there's a lot on dollar value of ecosystem services, but people are also starting to think about health, and the health issues are becoming more important and could actually be a nice direction to attract insurance companies and other stakeholders to begin to contribute to nature conservation. In Europe, it's a bit a mix of both, but they're also more about the value in terms of monetary value of nature. So depending on the local context, and it depends on the scale as well. So I can say this, I say this in general, but if you go to the local scale, we should be talking to the local people to see what matters to them and using whatever they identify as the things that matters to them to relate our message, to quantify, to bring them into our models and bring those results to them in the metrics that is important to them, I would say.
Oh, thank you so much. That was such an insightful answer. And I think with that, we, unless there are any other questions people want to ask right now, I think we can go ahead and thank Benis again. And I'll then pass it off to Renato. So thank you, Benis.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks,
I'm really honored. I feel pleased to be here.
Yeah, and we're just delighted to have you join the RCN in whatever capacity that you can manage or your group has time for. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll be very happy to join, to bring my group and to interact with you more. I find the work that you are doing very, very interesting and exciting. And I still want to do more in terms of the biodiversity side of things, which is it makes this link a very important link for me.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Benis.
Yeah.